Are you listening? Damn. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi everyone, we're going to begin our notes over big business and labor. This unit is going to be focusing on tycoons and labor unions. And here we can see our background political cartoon for this unit, this section's notes. And this is a cartoon caricature of John D. Rockefeller holding the U.S. Treasury in the palm of his hand. And the caption for this is, "What a funny little government." And you can see he's just like in complete control of the U.S. Treasury, of the U.S. government. In the background, you can see thousands of oil barrels, which of course was Rockefeller's area of expertise. He was an oil tycoon. And in the background, the U.S. Capitol has smokestacks coming out of it. And the message of this cartoon is to communicate that tycoons like Rockefeller controlled the government and controlled the country. And it was no stretch of the imagination that they did. For, of course, these guys were the billionaires of their time. They were the Jeff Bezos, the Elon Musks, the Bill Gates of their time. And so we begin our notes. Big Business and Labor in the Late 1800s. The Rise of the Tycoon and the Union by Christopher W. Miller, ZHS. The railroad is big business, there's no doubt. It's the first big business. One of the most important and influential industries in the late 1800s was the railroad industry. By giving railroad companies huge land grants and loans, the U.S. government would put these companies in positions of power. One railroad executive, George M. Pullman, created an entire town just for his company's workers. In 1880, he bought 4,000 acres of land outside of Chicago for this purpose. He basically controlled his workers' lives in this town. Here's a picture of George Pullman and his utopian town. And now we're going to watch a short video about George Pullman.
It was an age of giants. George M. Pullman was a self-made tycoon, willing to take a chance on a dream. In 1880, he purchased 4,000 acres just south of Chicago. Lake Calumet on the east, Illinois Central Railroad on the west. The perfect place for a commercial utopia. Build factories and a town for the workers. Make the homes comfortable and modern. Fresh air from Lake Calumet. Sunshine, security, good schools, wonderful architecture everywhere. Workers applied by the thousands. Only the best were chosen. Healthy, happy workers to build the world's finest railroad cars and never strike. Walk to the plants together, work together, come home together, go to church together. The same basic pay and the same basic rent. The same food, the same clothes. 14 years in a row, Pullman was voted the world's most perfect town. In 1893, the Columbian World's Fair was held in Chicago. Pullman was a major attraction. Scholars from all over the world scrutinized the workers. How was the regimentation in their lives affecting their development? Was it a good life? 1893 was a bad year for business, a depression. Orders for Pullman cars plummeted. Not enough income to pay the expenses. Debts screaming to be paid. George had to tighten his belt. The Pullman workers were given big pay cuts, but their full rent had to be paid. Many were working every day and destitute. 1,000 families without food. 2,000 workers laid off and must leave their homes with nowhere to go. And no help from George the benefactor. He had become a feudal lord. If someone complained, they were fired. The workers defiantly walked off the job. George locked the doors. A lot of negativity on both sides. Eugene Debs called a nationwide strike in support of the Pullman workers. And many strikers were killed. When order was restored, a large number of Pullman workers had lost their jobs and homes. The love affair had ended. George Pullman became a reviled caricature of an unjust tycoon. 3 years later, he was dead. The homes in the town were soon sold off for private ownership. The experiment was over.
So that was George Pullman and his town, which seemed successful but ultimately was not. Railroads went beyond controlling just people's lives. It even affected time. The system of time zones we have was created in part to unify time standards across the country so that train conductors wouldn't have to worry about so many time changes as they traveled. Traveling from town to town, each town had a different time, and so it would be rather difficult to keep track. So we established the 4 standard time zones: Pacific, Mountain, Central, Eastern. This is as a result of the railroad. This shows you how big of a business railroad was. Transcontinental Railroad, which we have already studied through the Charlie Brown episode, was completed in 1869 and had numerous positive and negative effects on the U.S. It cut travel time across the country from 6 months to 10 days, even 7 days in some cases. It allowed produce to be shipped quickly from west to east and manufactured goods to be shipped from east to west. It allowed for the increased settlement of the West. The Native American way of life, though, on the Great Plains ended, so now we're getting into the negatives here. Many workers were killed or injured working on the Transcontinental Railroad, and Chinese workers suffered from discrimination and were not given enough credit for the work they did working for the Central Pacific. If you remember correctly, 2 railroad companies worked on it, the Central Pacific coming from Sacramento in the west, and the Union Pacific coming from Omaha, Nebraska in the east. Here's that picture of the day when the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, taken by Andrew Russell. Government's policies toward big business. During the latter half of the 19th century, if the U.S. government didn't help business grow, it certainly did not interfere with it. Many would justify the government's actions through the theory of social Darwinism, and this theory followed Charles Darwin's theory of biological evolution, which stated that in nature the strong survive and adapt to their environment, while the weak die out. Under this theory, the business world is the same. Here's a picture of Charles Darwin and a little cartoon with Homer Simpson showing the evolution of Homer. This would seem to justify the belief in laissez-faire economics. This is an economic theory. Laissez-faire is French for hands-off. In this belief, business was not regulated by government, but allowed to develop on its own. Natural law forbid intervention. We shouldn't interfere with the business. Government's just going to muck everything up. There's a little cartoon to kind of emphasize that. Yeah, it's time for the laissez-faire. Don't you mean laissez-faire? Blank stare. Laissez-faire means a hands-off government. There is no such thing as a laissez-faire. And besides, if there was a laissez-faire, then they would be too lazy to even set it up. Ba-dum-bum-ching. The rise of the Tycoon. Now we're going to talk about the Tycoon and how such people as John Rockefeller came to power. With the government not interfering, of course people could become super rich. Simply defined, a tycoon is somebody who has extreme wealth and power. Laissez-faire economics would allow people to become tycoons. One such tycoon was Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie was an immigrant child from Scotland, and he would use new strategies to help him move to the top of the steel industry. Here's a picture of Andrew Carnegie, and if we have watched the episode of The Men Who Built America, where we talk about Andrew Carnegie and his rivalry with John Rockefeller, we would learn about some of the tactics Carnegie used. We're going to just overview some of them here. He would use the practice of vertical integration, in which he would buy out his suppliers in order to control raw materials and the transportation systems. He would also originate the process of horizontal integration, in which he would buy out his competitors' companies and merge them together. These two processes would give Carnegie a monopoly or complete control over his industry. I like to use this graphic when I explain vertical and horizontal integration. Imagine horizontal integration like McDonald's buying out all of its competitors, Burger King, Taco Bell, Wendy's. That is a horizontal line across. You buy out your competitors. But vertical integration would be cows, buying up cattle ranches, the potato farms, the chicken coops, for lack of a better word right now. You buy out your suppliers, right? So vertical integration, you buy out your suppliers. Horizontal integration, you buy out your competitors. Then we're going to talk about some of the other robber barons besides Carnegie. They would be known as robber barons because of their great wealth and their abuse of the public. Oil industry tycoon John D. Rockefeller was one such man. Rockefeller would create the Standard Oil Company of Ohio. By 1880, it controlled 90% of the oil refining business. Rockefeller had kept much of his money. Here's a younger Rockefeller on the left and an older Rockefeller on the right. If you remember correctly, as we had discussed in class, Rockefeller made his headquarters in Cleveland. Banker and industrialist J.P. Morgan would create a monopoly through the holding company, a company whose only purpose was to buy out stock of other companies. He would form the United States Steel Corporation in 1901, which is a good example of a holding company. Here's a picture of J.P. Morgan. And if you are familiar with Chase Bank, Chase Bank's full name is J.P. Morgan Chase, named after him. So his bank still goes on today. William Vanderbilt was a tycoon in the railroad industry, and he would give special rates to his favorite customers, bribe officials when they found out about the tactic, and fought regulation. Also, raising transport costs for farmers, for example. This picture of William Vanderbilt. And finally, we're going to talk about Henry Ford. Henry Ford wasn't really a robber baron, but was one of the last great industrialists of this era. He didn't invent the car or the assembly line, as some people like to say, but he developed both and made them common sights in U.S. industry. His Model T car was the first affordable and reliable car for the masses in 1908. Here's a picture of Henry Ford on the left and his famous Model T on the right. Now we'll talk about the abuses of big business. In order to cut costs and maximize profits, owners gave their workers few benefits. Hours were long, 12 to 16-hour workdays were normal. Factories called for a 7-day work week, and injuries and death were common. Child labor was acceptable. Things such as vacation, sick leave, injury compensation, unemployment compensation, these were all unheard of. Here's a picture of one of the abuses. These are breaker boys. They would work in coal mines. Again, part of the result of child labor was that kids didn't have a childhood. A childhood was a luxury, and parents were more than happy to allow their kids to work. If you're old enough to work, then go and do it. Send your money back to the family, help support the family. And what's sad is that a lot of these kids would suffer after they finished working. They would be inhaling coal dust all the time, and would have a terrible effect on their health and their lungs in the future, even if they stopped being breaker boys. Just one example of kids working at child labor. The labor unions would form to protect workers. Workers would unite to form labor unions. These are organizations designed to protect the rights of workers who have the same jobs. The National Labor Union, founded in 1866, was the first labor union in the United States. Eventually, two major types of unions would be formed: craft/trade unions and industrial unions. The craft unions would include skilled workers. The first one of note was Samuel Gomper's American Federation of Labor in 1886. That's one of your vocab words. There's a picture of Samuel Gompers who helped form that union. And we have industrial unions that felt that both skilled and unskilled workers should be included. The first such union of this type was the American Railway Union, started by Eugene V. Debs in 1894. Here's a picture of Eugene V. Debs. Unions would use strikes. Unions developed a strike where workers would refuse to do their jobs until conditions changed. Industry and the government would respond harshly to strikes because they could disrupt the economy. The Great Strike of 1877 was a result of railway workers protesting a wage cut. It caused the shutdown of freight train and some passenger train traffic all over the nation for a week. The economy ground to a halt. There were no highways. There were no truck freight passage or airplanes or anything like that could take the place of this and pick up the slack. So railway owners were at a loss. Their workers were striking, and they were losing money daily. The strike would encourage labor leaders in other strikes. Often these would turn violent. The Haymarket Affair, the Homestead strike, and the Pullman Company strike of the late 1800s would all have violent ends. And now I'm going to show you a quick video of the Homestead strike.
In the early months of 1892, tensions inside the Homestead steel mill reach a boiling point. Carnegie and Frick set aside their differences to battle the workers' union together.
The unions wanted higher wages, shorter hours. Conditions were perfectly appalling. The workers were simply cogs in the wheel. They were almost non-human.
Carnegie and Frick reunited on the idea that they were going to get rid of the union.
Carnegie puts Frick in charge of day-to-day negotiations.
Get your men back to work.
A decision that will have deadly results.
Frick was interested in driving down prices, and the Amalgamated Association was the thing he hated more than anything.
His approach to the steel union is simple. Workers' rates must follow the selling price of the product.
in 1892, Carnegie and Frick sent a message to the amalgamated union at Homestead that the wages had to fall and that the mill was going to operate non-union in the future.
We're brothers in this. We have to stay together so our families can eat. If Frick thinks we're gonna back down, then he doesn't know the Homestead boys. Are you with me? Yeah! And we're gonna strike! 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 Strike!
They're going to strike. I say we break it, bring in all new people.
Carnegie certainly wanted to get rid of the union, but he thought they could do it without this confrontational approach that Frick was advocating.
I say we simply starve them out, close the plant, and when they can barely feed themselves, they'll come back to us, desperate. We get what we want, and they keep their jobs.
The plant would be closed for months. We'd lose millions in profit. Investors will start pulling out. You know where I stand.
Long term, Henry. Think long term.
That was the Homestead strike video. Owners would crack down on strikers like them. They would hire private security companies to physically break up protesters. The end result would usually be that the government would send in troops to put an end to the strike and to restore order. One woman who helped organize unions was a woman named Mary Harris Jones. She would bring attention to child labor and bad working conditions in an attempt to change the status quo. The government would eventually pass laws to try to ease the situation. The U.S. Congress would try to protect farmers from railroads in 1887 by passing the Interstate Commerce Act, which would allow the federal government to regulate trade between the states. This act would create the Interstate Commerce Commission, but it did not have an immediate effect. The U.S. government tried to stop the abuses of business through the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, which was designed to break up trusts. Another word for trust is a monopoly. The Supreme Court would usually throw out cases the government brought to it under the act, however, and prosecutors would eventually give up. This act would not become more important until the early 20th century. But who made up the unions and who did all the work? Well, next unit, we're going to look at immigration and its effects on the United States, and many immigrants would make up these unions and their membership.
Yeah.